Section 42 of The World as Will and Idea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Moyer. The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R. B. Haldane and J. Kemp. Fourth Book, The World as Will, Section 68, Part 2. We find, however, that which we have called the denial of the will to live more fully developed, more variously expressed, and more vividly represented in the ancient Sanskrit writings than could be the case in the Christian Church and the Western world. That this important ethical view of life could here attain to a fuller development and a more distinct expression is perhaps principally to be ascribed to the fact that it was not confined by an element quite foreign to it, as Christianity is by the Jewish theology, to which its sublime author had necessarily to adopt and accommodate it, partly consciously, partly, it may be, unconsciously. Thus Christianity is made up of two very different constituent parts, and I should like to call the purely ethical part especially and indeed exclusively Christian, and distinguish it from the Jewish dogmatism with which it is combined. If, as has often been feared, and especially at the present time, that excellent and salutary religion should altogether decline, I should look for the reason of this simply in the fact that it does not consist of one single element, but of two originally different elements, which have only been combined through the accident of history. In such a case, dissolution had to follow through the separation of these elements, arising from their different relationship to and reaction against the progressive spirit of the age. But even after this dissolution, the purely ethical part must always remain uninjured, because it is indestructible. Our knowledge of Hindu literature is still very imperfect, yet as we find their ethical teaching variously and powerfully expressed in the Vedas, Puranas, poems, myths, legends of their saints, maxims, and precepts, we see that it inculcates love of our neighbor with complete renunciation of self-love. Love generally, not confined to mankind, but including all living creatures. Benevolence, even to the giving away of the hard-won wages of daily toil. Unlimited patience towards all who injure us. The requital of all wickedness, however base, with goodness and love. Voluntary and glad endurance of all ignominy. Abstinence from all animal food. Perfect chastity and renunciation of all sensual pleasure for him who strives after true holiness. The surrender of all possessions, the forsaking of every dwelling place and of all relatives. Deep, unbroken solitude, spent in silent contemplation, with voluntary penance, and terrible slow self-torture for the absolute mortification of the will, torture which extends to voluntary death by starvation, or by men giving themselves up to crocodiles, or flinging themselves over the sacred precipice in the Himalayas, or being buried alive, or finally by flinging themselves under the wheels of the huge car of an idol drawn along amid the singing, shouting, and dancing of bayadères. And even yet these precepts, whose origin reaches back more than 4,000 years, are carried out in practice, in some cases even to the utmost extreme, and this notwithstanding the fact that the Hindu nation has been broken up into so many parts. A religion which demands the greatest sacrifices, and which has yet remained so long in practice in a nation that embraces so many millions of persons, cannot be an arbitrarily invented superstition, but must have its foundation in the nature of man. But besides this, if we read the life of a Christian penitent or saint, and also that of a Hindu saint, we cannot sufficiently wonder at the harmony we find between them. In the case of such radically different dogmas, customs, and circumstances, the inward life and effort of both is the same, and the same harmony prevails in the maxims prescribed for both of them. For example, Tauler speaks of the absolute poverty which one ought to seek, and which consists in giving away and divesting oneself completely of everything from which one might draw comfort or worldly pleasure, clearly because all this constantly affords new nourishment to the will, which it is intended to destroy entirely. And as an Indian counterpart of this, we find in the precepts of Fo that the sannyasi, who ought to be without a dwelling and entirely without property, is further finally enjoined not to lay himself down often under the same tree, lest he should acquire a preference or inclination for it above other trees. The Christian mystic and the teacher of the Vedanta philosophy agree in this respect also. They both regard all outward works and religious exercises as superfluous for him who has attained to perfection. So much agreement in the case of such different ages and nations is a practical proof that what is expressed here is not, as optimistic dullness likes to assert, an eccentricity and perversity of the mind, but an essential side of human nature, which only appears so rarely because of its excellence. I have now indicated the sources from which there may be obtained a direct knowledge, drawn from life itself, of the phenomena in which the denial of the will to live exhibits itself. In some respects this is the most important point of our whole work, yet I have only explained it quite generally, for it is better to refer to those who speak from direct experience than to increase the size of this book unduly by weak repetitions of what is said by them. I only wish to add a little to the general indication of the nature of this state. We saw above that the wicked man, by the vehemence of his volition, suffers constant, consuming, inward pain, and finally, if all objects of volition are exhausted, quenches the fiery thirst of his self-will by the sight of the suffering of others. He, on the contrary, who has attained to the denial of the will to live, however poor, joyless, and full of privation his condition may appear when looked at externally, is yet filled with inward joy and the true peace of heaven. It is not the restless strain of life, the jubilant delight which has keen suffering as its preceding or succeeding condition, in the experience of the man who loves life, but it is a peace that cannot be shaken, a deep rest and inward serenity, a state which we cannot behold without the greatest longing when it is brought before our eyes or our imagination, because we at once recognize it as that which alone is right, infinitely surpassing everything else, upon which our better self cries within us the great sapere aude. Then we feel that every gratification of our wishes won from the world is merely like the alms which the beggar receives from life today, that he may hunger again on the morrow. Resignation, on the contrary, is like an inherited estate. It frees the owner forever from all care. It will be remembered from the third book that the aesthetic pleasure in the beautiful consists in great measure in the fact that in entering the state of pure contemplation we are lifted for the moment above all willing, i.e., all wishes and cares. We become, as it were, freed from ourselves. We are no longer the individual whose knowledge is subordinated to the service of its constant willing, the correlative of the particular thing to which objects are motives, but the eternal subject of knowing purified from will, the correlative of the Platonic idea. And we know that these moments in which, delivered from the ardent strain of will, we seem to rise out of the heavy atmosphere of earth, are the happiest which we experience. From this we can understand how blessed the life of a man must be whose will is silenced, not merely for a moment, as in the enjoyment of the beautiful, but for ever, indeed altogether extinguished, except as regards the last glimmering spark that retains the body in life, and will be extinguished with its death. Such a man, who, after many bitter struggles with his own nature, has finally conquered entirely, continues to exist only as a pure, knowing being, the undimmed mirror of the world. Nothing can trouble him more, nothing can move him, for he has cut all the thousand cords of will which hold us bound to the world, and as desire, fear, envy, anger, drag us hither and thither in constant pain. He now looks back smiling, and at rest on the delusions of this world, which once were able to move and agonize his spirit also, but which now stand before him as utterly indifferent to him, as the chessmen when the game is ended, or as, in the morning, the cast-off masquerading dress which worried and disquieted us in a night in Carnival. Life and its forms now pass before him as a fleeting illusion, as a light morning dream before half-waking eyes, the real world already shining through it, so that it can no longer deceive. And like this morning dream, they finally vanish altogether, without any violent transition. From this we can understand the meaning of Madame Guyon, when towards the end of her autobiography she often expresses herself thus: "Everything is alike to me. I cannot will anything more. Often I know not whether I exist or not." In order to express how, after the extinction of the will, the death of the body, which is indeed only the manifestation of the will, and therefore loses all significance when the will is abolished, can no longer have any bitterness, but is very welcome, I may be allowed to quote the words of that holy penitent, although they are not very elegantly turned. Midi de la gloire, jour où il n'y a plus de nuit, vie qui ne craint plus la mort dans la mort même. parce que la mort a vaincu la mort, et que celui qui a souffert la première mort ne goûtera plus la seconde mort. Vie de Madame de Guyon, Volume 2, page 13. We must not, however, suppose that when, by means of the knowledge which acts as a quieter of will, the denial of the will to live has once appeared, it never wavers or vacillates, and that we can rest upon it as on an assured possession. Rather, it must ever anew be attained by a constant battle. For since the body is the will itself only in the form of objectivity, or as manifestation in the world as idea, so long as the body lives, the whole will to live exists potentially, and constantly strives to become actual, and to burn again with all its ardour. Therefore, that peace and blessedness in the life of holy men which we have described is only found as the flower which proceeds from the constant victory over the will, and the ground in which it grows is the constant battle with the will to live, for no one can have lasting peace upon earth. We therefore see the histories of the inner life of saints full of spiritual conflicts, temptations, and absence of grace, i.e., the kind of knowledge which makes all motives ineffectual, and as an universal quieter, silences all volition, gives the deepest peace, and opens the door of freedom. Therefore also we see those who have once attained to the denial of the will to live strive with all their might to keep upon this path by enforced renunciation of every kind, by penance and severity of life, and by selecting whatever is disagreeable to them, all in order to suppress the will, which is constantly springing up anew. Hence, finally, because they already know the value of salvation, their anxious carefulness to retain the hard-won blessing, their scruples of conscience about every innocent pleasure, or about every little excitement of their vanity, which here also dies last, the most immovable, the most active, and the most foolish of all the inclinations of man. By the term asceticism, which I have used so often, I mean in its narrower sense this intentional breaking of the will by the refusal of what is agreeable, and the selection of what is disagreeable, the voluntarily chosen life of penance and self-chastisement for the continual mortification of the will. We see this practiced by him who has attained to the denial of the will in order to enable him to persist in it. But suffering in general, as it is inflicted by fate, is a second way, deuteros plus, of attaining to that denial. Indeed, we may assume that most men only attain to it in this way, and that it is the suffering which is personally experienced, not that which is merely known, which most frequently produces complete resignation, often only at the approach of death. For only in the case of a few is the mere knowledge which, seeing through the principium individuationis, first produces perfect goodness of disposition and universal love of humanity, and finally enables them to regard all the suffering of the world as their own. Only in the case of a few, I say, is this knowledge sufficient to bring about the denial of the will. Even with him who approaches this point, It is almost invariably the case that the tolerable condition of his own body, the flattery of the moment, the delusion of hope, and the satisfaction of the will, which is ever presenting itself anew, i.e., lust, is a constant hindrance to the denial of the will, and a constant temptation to the renewed assertion of it. Therefore, in this respect, all these illusions have been personified as the devil. Thus in most cases the will must be broken by great personal suffering before its self-conquest appears. Then we see the man who has passed through all the increasing degrees of affliction with the most vehement resistance, and is finally brought to the verge of despair, suddenly retire into himself, know himself and the world, change his whole nature, rise above himself and all suffering, as if purified and sanctified by it, in inviolable peace, blessedness, and sublimity, willingly renounce everything he previously desired with all his might, and joyfully embrace death. It is the refined silver of the denial of the will to live that suddenly comes forth from the purifying flame of suffering. It is salvation. Sometimes we see even those who were very wicked purified to this degree by great grief. They have become new beings and are completely changed. Therefore their former misdeeds trouble their consciences no more, yet they willingly atone for them by death, and gladly see the end of the manifestation of that will which is now foreign to them and abhorred by them. The great Goethe has given us a distinct and visible representation of this denial of the will, brought about by great misfortunes and despair of all deliverance, in his immortal masterpiece Faust, in the story of the sufferings of Gretchen. I know no parallel to this in poetry. It is a perfect example of the second path that leads to the denial of the will, not, as the first, through the mere knowledge of the sufferings of a whole world which one has voluntarily acquired, but through excessive suffering experienced in one's own person. Many tragedies certainly end by conducting their strong-willed heroes to the point of entire resignation, and then generally the will to live and its manifestation end together. But no representation that is known to me brings what is essential to that change so distinctly before us, free from all that is extraneous, as the part of Faust I have referred to. In actual life we see that those unfortunate persons who have to drink to the dregs the greatest cup of suffering, since when all hope is taken from them they have to face with full consciousness a shameful, violent, and often painful death on the scaffold, are very frequently changed in this way. We must not indeed assume that there is so great a difference between their character and that of most men, as their fate would seem to indicate, but must attribute the latter for the most part to circumstances. Yet they are guilty, and to a considerable degree bad. We see, however, many of them, when they have entirely lost hope, changed in the way referred to. They now show actual goodness and purity of disposition, true abhorrence of doing any act in the least degree bad or unkind. They forgive their enemies, even if it is through them that they innocently suffer, and not with words merely, and a sort of hypocritical fear of the judges of the lower world, but in reality and with inward earnestness and no desire for revenge. Indeed, their sufferings and death at last becomes dear to them, for the denial of the will to live has appeared. They often decline the deliverance when it is offered, and die gladly, peacefully, and happily. To them the last secret of life has revealed itself in their excessive pain, the secret that misery and wickedness, sorrow and hate, the sufferer and the inflicter of suffering, however different they may appear to the knowledge which follows the principle of sufficient reason, are in themselves one, the manifestation of that one will to live which objectifies its conflict with itself by means of the principium individuationis. They have learned to know both sides in full measure, the badness and the misery. And since at last they see the identity of the two, they reject them both at once. They deny the will to live. In what myths and dogmas they account to their reason for this intuitive and direct knowledge and for their own change is, as has been said, a matter of no importance. Matthias Claudius must without doubt have witnessed a change of mind of this description when he wrote the remarkable essay in the Wandsbeker Boten, Part 1, page 115, with the title Bekehrungsgeschichte des, name omitted, History of the Conversion of, name omitted, which concludes thus: man's way of thinking may pass from one point of the periphery to the opposite point, and again back to the former point, if circumstances mark out for him the path. And these changes in a man are really nothing great or interesting, but that remarkable Catholic transcendental change in which the whole circle is irreparably broken up, and all the laws of psychology become vain and empty when the coat is stripped from the shoulders, or at least turned outside in, and as it were scales fall from a man's eyes, is such that every one who has breath in his nostrils forsakes father and mother, if he can hear or experience something certain about it. The approach of death and hopelessness are in other respects not absolutely necessary for such a purification through suffering. Even without them, the knowledge of the contradiction of the will to live with itself can, through great misfortune and pain, force an entrance, and the vanity of all striving become recognized. Hence it has often happened that men who have led a very restless life in the full strain of the passions, kings, heroes, and adventurers, suddenly change, betake themselves to resignation and penance, become hermits or monks. To this class belong all true accounts of conversions. For example, that of Raymond Lully, who had long wooed a fair lady, and was at last admitted to her chamber, anticipating the fulfilment of all his wishes, when she, opening her bodice, showed him her bosom, frightfully eaten with cancer. From that moment, as if he had looked into hell, he was changed. He forsook the court of the king of Majorca, and went into the desert to do penance. This conversion is very like that of the Abbé Rancé, which I have briefly related in the 48th chapter of the supplement. If we consider how in both cases the transition from the pleasure to the horror of life was the occasion of it, this throws some light upon the remarkable fact that it is among the French, the most cheerful, gay, sensuous, and frivolous nation in Europe, that by far the strictest of all monastic orders, the Trappists, arose, was re-established by Rancé after its fall, and has maintained itself to the present day in all its purity and strictness, in spite of revolutions, church reformations, and encroachments of infidelity. But a knowledge such as that referred to above, of the nature of this existence, may leave us again, along with the occasion of it, and the will to live, and with it the previous character may reappear. Thus we see that the passionate Benvenuto Cellini was changed in this way, once when he was in prison, and again when very ill, but when the suffering passed over, he fell back again into his old state. In general, the denial of the will to live by no means proceeds from suffering with the necessity of an effect from its cause, but the will remains free. For this is indeed the one point at which its freedom appears directly in the phenomenon. Hence the astonishment which Asmus expresses so strongly at the transcendental change. In the case of every suffering, it is always possible to conceive a will which exceeds it in intensity, and is therefore unconquered by it. Thus Plato speaks in the Phaedon of men who up to the moment of their execution feast, drink, and indulge in sensuous pleasure, asserting life even to the death. Shakespeare shows us in Cardinal Beaufort the fearful end of a profligate, who dies full of despair, for no suffering or death can break his will, which is vehement to the extreme of wickedness. The more intense the will is, the more glaring is the conflict of its manifestation, and thus the greater is the suffering. A world which was the manifestation of a far more intense will to live than this world manifests, would produce so much the greater suffering, would thus be a hell. All suffering, since it is a mortification and a call to resignation, has potentially a sanctifying power. This is the explanation of the fact that every great misfortune or deep pain inspires a certain awe. But the sufferer only really becomes an object of reverence when, surveying the course of his life as a chain of sorrows, or mourning some great and incurable misfortune, he does not really look at the special combination of circumstances which has plunged his own life into suffering, nor stops at the single great misfortune that has befallen him, for in so doing his knowledge still follows the principle of sufficient reason, and clings to the particular phenomenon. He still wills life, only not under the conditions which have happened to him. But only then, I say, he is truly worthy of reverence, when he raises his glance from the particular to the universal, when he regards his suffering as merely an example of the whole, and for him, since in a moral regard he partakes of genius, one case stands for 1,000, so that the whole of life conceived as essentially suffering brings him to resignation. Therefore it inspires reverence when, in Goethe's Torquato Tasso, the princess speaks of how her own life and that of her relations has always been sad and joyless, and yet regards the matter from an entirely universal point of view. A very noble character we always imagine with a certain trace of quiet sadness, which is anything but a constant fretfulness at daily annoyances. This would be an ignoble trait, and lead us to fear a bad disposition. But is a consciousness derived from knowledge of the vanity of all possessions, of the suffering of all life, not merely of his own? But such knowledge may primarily be awakened by the personal experience of suffering, especially some one great sorrow, as a single unfulfilled wish brought Petrarch to that state of resigned sadness concerning the whole of life which appeals to us so pathetically in his works. For the Daphne he pursued had to flee from his hands in order to leave him instead of herself the immortal laurel. When through some such great and irrevocable denial of fate the will is to some extent broken, almost nothing else is desired, and the character shows itself mild, just, noble, and resigned. When, finally, grief has no definite object, but extends itself over the whole of life, then it is to a certain extent a going into itself, a withdrawal, a gradual disappearance of the will, whose visible manifestation, the body, it imperceptibly but surely undermines, so that a man feels a certain loosening of his bonds, a mild foretaste of that death which promises to be the abolition at once of the body and of the will. Therefore a secret pleasure accompanies this grief, and it is this, as I believe, which the most melancholy of all nations has called the joy of grief. But here also lies the danger of sentimentality, both in life itself and in the representation of it in poetry. When a man is always mourning and lamenting without courageously rising to resignation. In this way we lose both earth and heaven, and retain merely a watery sentimentality. Only if suffering assumes the form of pure knowledge, and this, acting as a quieter of the will, brings about resignation, is it worthy of reverence. In this regard, however, we feel a certain respect at the sight of every great sufferer, which is akin to the feeling excited by virtue and nobility of character, and also seems like a reproach of our own happy condition. We cannot help regarding every sorrow, both our own and those of others, as at least a potential advance towards virtue and holiness, and, on the contrary, pleasures and worldly satisfactions as a retrogression from them. This goes so far that every man who endures a great bodily or mental suffering, indeed every one who merely performs some physical labour which demands the greatest exertion, in the sweat of his brow and with evident exhaustion, yet with patience and without murmuring, every such man, I say, if we consider him with close attention, appears to us like a sick man who tries a painful cure, and who willingly and even with satisfaction endures the suffering it causes him, because he knows that the more he suffers, the more the cause of his disease is affected, and that therefore the present suffering is the measure of his cure. According to what has been said, the denial of the will to live, which is just what is called absolute, entire resignation, or holiness, always proceeds from that quieter of the will, which the knowledge of its inner conflict and essential vanity, expressing themselves in the suffering of all living things, becomes. The difference, which we have represented as two paths, consists in whether that knowledge is called up by suffering, which is merely and purely known, and is freely appropriated by means of the penetration of the principium individuationis, or by suffering which is directly felt by a man himself. True salvation, deliverance from life and suffering, cannot even be imagined without complete denial of the will. Till then, every one is simply this will itself, whose manifestation is an ephemeral existence, a constantly vain and empty striving, and the world full of suffering we have represented, to which all irrevocably and in like manner belong. For we found above that life is always assured to the will to live, and its one real form is the present, from which they can never escape, since birth and death reign in the phenomenal world. The Indian mythus expresses this by saying, "They are born again." The great ethical difference of character means this, that the bad man is infinitely far from the attainment of the knowledge from which the denial of the will proceeds, and therefore he is in truth actually exposed to all the miseries which appear in life as possible. For even the present fortunate condition of his personality is merely a phenomenon produced by the principium individuationis, and a delusion of Maya, the happy dream of a beggar. The sufferings which in the vehemence and ardour of his will he inflicts upon others are the measure of the suffering, the experience of which in his own person cannot break his will, and plainly lead it to the denial of itself. All true and pure love, on the other hand, and even all free justice, proceed from the penetration of the principium individuationis, which, if it appears with its full power, results in perfect sanctification and salvation, the phenomenon of which is the state of resignation described above, the unbroken peace which accompanies it, and the greatest delight in death. End of fourth book, The World as Will, section 68, part 2. Section 43 of The World as Will and Idea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Moyer. The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R. B. Haldane and J. Kemp. Fourth book, The World as Will, sections 69 and 70. Section 69. Suicide, the actual doing away with the individual manifestation of will, differs most widely from the denial of the will to live, which is the single outstanding act of free will in the manifestation, and is therefore, as Asmus calls it, the transcendental change. This last has been fully considered in the course of our work. Far from being denial of the will, suicide is a phenomenon of strong assertion of will, for the essence of negation lies in this, that the joys of life are shunned, not its sorrows. The suicide wills life, and is only dissatisfied with the conditions under which it has presented itself to him. He therefore by no means surrenders the will to live, but only life, in that he destroys the individual manifestation. He wills life, wills the unrestricted existence and assertion of the body, but the complication of circumstances does not allow this, and there results for him great suffering. The very will to live finds itself so much hampered in this particular manifestation that it cannot put forth its energies. It therefore comes to such a determination as is in conformity with its own nature, which lies outside the conditions of the principle of sufficient reason, and to which, therefore, all particular manifestations are alike indifferent, inasmuch as it itself remains unaffected by all appearing and passing away, and is the inner life of all things. For that firm inward assurance by reason of which we all live free from the constant dread of death, the assurance that a phenomenal existence can never be wanting to the will, supports our action even in the case of suicide. Thus the will to live appears just as much in suicide, Shiva, as in the satisfaction of self-preservation, Vishnu, and in the sensual pleasure of procreation, Brahma. This is the inner meaning of the unity of the Trimurtis, which is embodied in its entirety in every human being, though in time it raises now one, now another of its three heads. Suicide stands in the same relation to the denial of the will as the individual thing does to the idea. The suicide denies only the individual, not the species. We have already seen that as life is always assured to the will to live, and as sorrow is inseparable from life, suicide, the wilful destruction of the single phenomenal existence, is a vain and foolish act, for the thing in itself remains unaffected by it, even as the rainbow endures, however fast the drops which support it for the moment may change. But more than this, it is also the masterpiece of Maya as the most flagrant example of the contradiction of the will to live with itself. As we found this contradiction in the case of the lowest manifestations of will, in the permanent struggle of all the forces of nature and of all organic individuals for matter and time and space, and as we saw this antagonism come ever more to the front with terrible distinctness in the ascending grades of the objectification of the will, so at last, in the highest grade, the idea of man, it reaches the point at which not only the individuals which express the same idea extirpate each other, but even the same individual declares war against itself. The vehemence with which it wills life and revolts against what hinders it, namely suffering, brings it to the point of destroying itself, so that the individual will, by its own act, puts an end to that body which is merely its particular visible expression, rather than permit suffering to break the will. Just because the suicide cannot give up willing, he gives up living. The will asserts itself here even in putting an end to its own manifestation, because it can no longer assert itself otherwise. As, however, it was just the suffering which it so shuns that was able, as mortification of the will, to bring it to the denial of itself, and hence to freedom, so in this respect the suicide is like a sick man who, after a painful operation which would entirely cure him has been begun, will not allow it to be completed, but prefers to retain his disease. Suffering approaches and reveals itself as the possibility of the denial of will, but the will rejects it, in that it destroys the body, the manifestation of itself, in order that it may remain unbroken. This is the reason why almost all ethical teachers, whether philosophical or religious, condemn suicide, although they themselves can only give far-fetched sophistical reasons for their opinion. But if a human being was ever restrained from committing suicide by purely moral motives, the inmost meaning of this self-conquest, in whatever ideas his reason may have clothed it, was this: I will not shun suffering in order that it may help to put an end to the will to live, whose manifestation is so wretched, by so strengthening the knowledge of the real nature of the world which is already beginning to dawn upon me, that it may become the final quieter of my will, and may free me for ever. It is well known that from time to time cases occur in which the act of suicide extends to the children. The father first kills the children he loves, and then himself. Now, if we consider that conscience, religion, and all influencing ideas teach him to look upon murder as the greatest of crimes, and that, in spite of this, he yet commits it, in the hour of his own death, and when he is altogether uninfluenced by any egotistical motive, such a deed can only be explained in the following manner. In this case, the will of the individual, the father, recognizes itself immediately in the children, though involved in the delusion of mistaking the appearance for the true nature. And as he is at the same time deeply impressed with the knowledge of the misery of all life, he now thinks to put an end to the inner nature itself, along with the appearance, and thus seeks to deliver from existence and its misery both himself and his children, in whom he discerns himself as living again. It would be an error precisely analogous to this to suppose that one may reach the same end as is attained through voluntary chastity by frustrating the aim of nature in fecundation. Or, indeed, if, in consideration of the unendurable suffering of life, parents were to use means for the destruction of their new-born children, instead of doing everything possible to ensure life to that which is struggling into it. For if the will to live is there, as it is the only metaphysical reality, or the thing in itself, no physical force can break it, but can only destroy its manifestation at this place and time. It itself can never be transcended except through knowledge. Thus the only way of salvation is that the will shall manifest itself unrestrictedly, in order that in this individual manifestation it may come to apprehend its own nature. Only as the result of this knowledge can the will transcend itself, and thereby end the suffering which is inseparable from its manifestation. It is quite impossible to accomplish this end by physical force, as by destroying the germ, or by killing the newborn child, or by committing suicide. Nature guides the will to the light, just because it is only in the light that it can work out its salvation. Therefore the aims of nature are to be promoted in every way as soon as the will to live, which is its inner being, has determined itself. There is a species of suicide which seems to be quite distinct from the common kind, though its occurrence has perhaps not yet been fully established. It is starvation, voluntarily chosen on the ground of extreme asceticism. All instances of it, however, have been accompanied and obscured by much religious fanaticism and even superstition. Yet it seems that the absolute denial of will may reach the point at which the will shall be wanting to take the necessary nourishment for the support of the natural life. This kind of suicide is so far from being the result of the will to live, that such a completely resigned ascetic only ceases to live because he has already altogether ceased to will. No other death than that by starvation is in this case conceivable, unless it were the result of some special superstition. For the intention to cut short the torment would itself be a stage in the assertion of will. The dogmas which satisfy the reason of such a penitent delude him with the idea that a being of a higher nature has inculcated the fasting to which his own inner tendency drives him. Old examples of this may be found in the Breslauer Sammlung von Natur- und Medizingeschichten, September 1799, page 363, in Bayle's Nouvelles de la République des Lettres, February 1685, page 189, in Zimmermann über die Einsamkeit, volume 1, page 182. In the Histoire de l'Académie des Sciences for 1764, an account by Hutoin, which is quoted in the Sammlung für praktische Ärzte, volume 1, page 69. More recent accounts may be found in Huffeland's Journal für praktische Heilkunde, volume 10, page 181, and volume 48, page 95. Also in Nasse's Zeitschrift für psychische Ärzte, 1819, part 3, page 460, and in the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal, 1809, volume 5, page 319. In the year 1833, all the papers announced that the English historian Dr. Lingard had died in January at Dover of voluntary starvation. According to later accounts, it was not he himself, but a relation of his who died. Still, in these accounts the persons were generally described as insane, and it is no longer possible to find out how far this was the case. But I will give here a more recent case of this kind, if it were only to ensure the preservation of one of the rare instances of this striking and extraordinary phenomenon of human nature, which, to all appearance at any rate, belongs to the category to which I wish to assign it, and could hardly be explained in any other way. This case is reported in the Nürnberger Korrespondenten of the 29th July, 1813, in these words: "We hear from Bern that in a thick wood near Thurnen a hut has been discovered in which was lying the body of a man who had been dead about a month. His clothes gave little or no clue to his social position. 2 very fine shirts lay beside him. The most important article, however, was a Bible interleaved with white paper, part of which had been written upon by the deceased. In this writing he gives the date of his departure from home, but does not mention where his home was. He then says that he was driven by the Spirit of God into the wilderness to pray and fast. During his journey he had fasted 7 days, and then he had again taken food. After this he had begun again to fast, and continued to do so for the same number of days as before. From this point we find each day marked with a stroke, and of these there are 5, at the expiration of which the pilgrim presumably died. There was further found a letter to a clergyman about a sermon which the deceased heard him preach, but the letter was not addressed. Between this voluntary death arising from extreme asceticism and the common suicide resulting from despair, there may be various intermediate species and combinations, though this is hard to find out. But human nature has depths, obscurities, and perplexities, the analysis and elucidation of which is a matter of the very greatest difficulty. Section 70. It might be supposed that the entire exposition now terminated of that which I call the denial of the will is irreconcilable with the earlier explanation of necessity, which belongs just as much to motivation as to every other form of the principle of sufficient reason, and according to which motives, like all causes, are only occasional causes, upon which the character unfolds its nature, and reveals it with the necessity of a natural law, on account of which we absolutely denied freedom as liberum arbitrium indifferentiae. But far from suppressing this here, I would call it to mind. In truth, real freedom, i.e., independence of the principle of sufficient reason, belongs to the will only as a thing in itself, not to its manifestation, whose essential form is everywhere the principle of sufficient reason, the element or sphere of necessity. But the one case in which that freedom can become directly visible in the manifestation is that in which it makes an end of what manifests itself, and because the mere manifestation, as a link in the chain of causes, the living body in time, which contains only phenomena, still continues to exist, the will which manifests itself through this phenomenon then stands in contradiction to it, for it denies what the phenomenon expresses. In such a case, the organs of generation, for example, as the visible form of the sexual impulse, are there, and in health. But yet, in the inmost consciousness, no sensual gratification is desired, and although the whole body is only the visible expression of the will to live, yet the motives which correspond to this will no longer act. Indeed, the dissolution of the body, the end of the individual, and in this way the greatest check to the natural will, is welcome and desired. Now, the contradiction between our assertions of the necessity of the determination of the will by motives in accordance with the character on the one hand, and of the possibility of the entire suppression of the will, whereby the motives become powerless, on the other hand, is only the repetition in the reflection of philosophy of this real contradiction which arises from the direct encroachment of the freedom of the will in itself, which knows no necessity, into the sphere of the necessity of its manifestation. But the key to the solution of these contradictions lies in the fact that the state in which the character is withdrawn from the power of motives does not proceed directly from the will, but from a changed form of knowledge. So long as the knowledge is merely that which is involved in the principium individuationis, and exclusively follows the principle of sufficient reason, the strength of the motives is irresistible. But when the principium individuationis is seen through, when the ideas, and indeed the inner nature of the thing in itself, as the same will in all, are directly recognized, and from this knowledge an universal quieter of volition arises, then the particular motives become ineffective, because the kind of knowledge which corresponds to them is obscured and thrown into the background by quite another kind. Therefore the character can never partially change, but must, with the consistency of a law of nature, carry out in the particular the will which it manifests as a whole. But this whole, the character itself, may be completely suppressed or abolished through the change of knowledge referred to above. It is this suppression or abolition which Asmus, as quoted above, marvels at and denotes the Catholic transcendental change. And in the Christian Church it has very aptly been called the new birth, and the knowledge from which it springs, the work of grace. Therefore it is not a question of a change, but of an entire suppression of the character. And hence it arises that, however different the characters which experience the suppression may have been before it, after it they show a great similarity in their conduct, though every one still speaks very differently according to his conceptions and dogmas. In this sense, then, the old philosophical doctrine of the freedom of the will, which has constantly been contested and constantly maintained, is not without ground, and the dogma of the Church of the work of grace and the new birth is not without meaning and significance. But we now unexpectedly see both united in one, and we can now also understand in what sense the excellent Malebranche could say, La liberté est un mystère, and was right. For precisely what the Christian mystics call the work of grace and the new birth is for us the single direct expression of the freedom of the will. It only appears if the will, having attained to a knowledge of its own real nature, receives from this a quieter, by means of which the motives are deprived of their effect, which belongs to the province of another kind of knowledge, the objects of which are merely phenomena. The possibility of the freedom which thus expresses itself is the greatest prerogative of man, which is for ever wanting to the brute, because the condition of it is the deliberation of reason, which enables him to survey the whole of life independent of the impression of the present. The brute is entirely without the possibility of freedom, as, indeed, it is without the possibility of a proper or deliberate choice following upon a completed conflict of motives, which, for this purpose, would have to be abstract ideas. Therefore, with the same necessity with which the stone falls to the earth, the hungry wolf buries its fangs in the flesh of its prey, without the possibility of the knowledge that it is itself the destroyed as well as the destroyer. Necessity is the kingdom of nature, freedom is the kingdom of grace. Now, because, as we have seen, that self-suppression of the will proceeds from knowledge, and all knowledge is involuntary, that denial of will also, that entrance into freedom, cannot be forcibly attained to by intention or design, but proceeds from the inmost relation of knowing and volition in the man, and therefore comes suddenly, as if spontaneously from without. This is why the Church has called it the work of grace, and that it still regards it as independent of the acceptance of grace corresponds to the fact that the effect of the quieter is finally a free act of will. And because, in consequence of such a work of grace, the whole nature of man is changed and reversed from its foundation, so that he no longer wills anything of all that he previously willed so intensely, so that it is as if a new man actually took the place of the old. The Church has called this consequence of the work of grace the new birth. For what it calls the natural man, to which it denies all capacity for good, is just the will to live, which must be denied if deliverance from an existence such as ours is to be attained. Behind our existence lies something else, which is only accessible to us if we have shaken off this world. Having regard not to the individuals according to the principle of sufficient reason, but to the idea of man in its unity, Christian theology symbolizes nature, the assertion of the will to live in Adam, whose sin, inherited by us, i.e., our unity with him in the idea, which is represented in time by the bond of procreation, makes us all partakers of suffering and eternal death. On the other hand, it symbolizes grace, the denial of the will, salvation in the incarnate God who, as free from all sin, that is, from all willing of life, cannot, like us, have proceeded from the most pronounced assertion of the will, nor can he, like us, have a body which is through and through simply concrete will, manifestation of the will, but born of a pure virgin, he has only a phantom body. This last is the doctrine of the Docetae, i.e., certain church fathers, who in this respect are very consistent. It is especially taught by Apelle, against whom and his followers Tertullian wrote. But even Augustine comments thus on the passage Romans 8:3, God sent his Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. Non enim caro peccati erat, quae non de carnale delectatione nata erat, sed tamen inerat ei similitudo carnis peccati, quia mortalis caro erat. Liber octoginta questiones. Question 66. He also teaches in his work entitled Opus Imperfectum, 147, that inherited sin is both sin and punishment at once. It is already present in newborn children, but only shows itself if they grow up. Yet the origin of this sin is to be referred to the will of the sinner. This sinner was Adam, but we all existed in him. Adam became miserable, and in him we have all become miserable. Certainly the doctrine of original sin, assertion of the will, and of salvation, denial of the will, is the great truth which constitutes the essence of Christianity, while most of what remains is only the clothing of it, the husk or accessories. Therefore, Jesus Christ ought always to be conceived in the universal, as the symbol or personification of the denial of the will to live, but never as an individual, whether according to his mythical history given in the Gospels, or according to the probably true history which lies at the foundation of this. For neither the one nor the other will easily satisfy us entirely. It is merely the vehicle of that conception for the people who always demand something actual. That in recent times Christianity has forgotten its true significance and degenerated into dull optimism does not concern us here. It is further an original and evangelical doctrine of Christianity, which Augustine, with the consent of the leaders of the Church, defended against the platitudes of the Pelagians, and which it was the principal aim of Luther's endeavour to purify from error and re-establish, as he expressly declares in his book De Servo Arbitrio, the doctrine that the will is not free, but originally subject to the inclination to evil. Therefore, according to this doctrine, the deeds of the will are always sinful and imperfect, and can never fully satisfy justice. And, finally, these works can never save us, but faith alone, a faith which itself does not spring from resolution and free will, but from the work of grace, without our cooperation, comes to us as from without. Not only the dogmas referred to before, but also this last genuine evangelical dogma belongs to those which at the present day an ignorant and dull opinion rejects as absurd or hides. For, in spite of Augustine and Luther, it adheres to the vulgar Pelagianism, which the rationalism of the day really is, and treats as antiquated those deeply significant dogmas which are peculiar and essential to Christianity in the strictest sense, while, on the other hand, it holds fast and regards as the principal matter only the dogma that originates in Judaism, and has been retained from it, and is merely historically connected with Christianity. We, however, recognize in the doctrine referred to above the truth completely agreeing with the result of our own investigations. We see that true virtue and holiness of disposition have their origin not in deliberate choice, works, but in knowledge, faith, just as we have in like manner developed it from our leading thought. If it were works, which spring from motives and deliberate intention, that led to salvation, then, however one may turn it, virtue would always be a prudent, methodical, far-seeing egoism. But the faith to which the Christian Church promises salvation is this, that as through the fall of the first man we are all partakers of sin and subject to death and perdition, through the divine substitute, through grace and the taking upon himself of our fearful guilt, we are all saved, without any merit of our own, of the person. Since that which can proceed from the intentional, determined by motives, action of the person, works, can never justify us, from its very nature, just because it is intentional, action induced by motives, opus operatum. Thus, in this faith there is implied, first of all, that our condition is originally and essentially an incurable one, from which we need salvation. Then, that we ourselves essentially belong to evil, and are so firmly bound to it that our works, according to law and precept, i.e., according to motives, can never satisfy justice nor save us. But salvation is only obtained through faith, i.e., through a changed mode of knowing, and this faith can only come through grace, thus as from without. This means that the salvation is one which is quite foreign to our person, and points to a denial and surrender of this person necessary to salvation. Works, the result of the law as such, can never justify, because they are always action following upon motives. Luther demands, in his book De Libertate Christiana, that after the entrance of faith, the good works shall proceed from it entirely of themselves, as symptoms, as fruits of it, yet by no means as constituting in themselves a claim to merit, justification, or reward, but taking place quite voluntarily and gratuitously. So we also hold that from the ever clearer penetration of the principium individuationis proceeds, first, merely free justice, then love, extending to the complete abolition of egoism, and finally resignation or denial of the will. I have here introduced these dogmas of Christian theology, which in themselves are foreign to philosophy, merely for the purpose of showing that the ethical doctrine which proceeds from our whole investigation, and is in complete agreement and connection with all its parts, although new and unprecedented in its expression, is by no means so in its real nature, but fully agrees with the Christian dogmas properly so called, and indeed, as regards its essence, was contained and present in them. It also agrees quite as accurately with the doctrines and ethical teachings of the sacred books of India, which in their turn are presented in quite different forms. At the same time, the calling to mind of the dogmas of the Christian Church serves to explain and illustrate the apparent contradiction between the necessity of all expressions of character when motives are presented, the kingdom of nature, on the one hand, and the freedom of the will in itself to deny itself and abolish the character with all the necessity of the motives based upon it, the kingdom of grace, on the other hand. End of fourth book, The World as
Section 44 of The World as Will and Idea. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Paul Gonzalez. The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kempt. Section 44. I now end the general account of ethics, and with it the whole development which it has been my object to impart, and I by no means desire to conceal here an objection which concerns this last part of my exposition, but rather to point out that it lies in the nature of the question, and that it is quite impossible to remove it. It is this, that after our investigation has brought us to the point at which we have before our eyes perfect holiness, the denial and surrender of all volition, and thus deliverance from a world whose whole existence we had found to be suffering, this appears to us as a passing away into empty nothingness. On this I must first remark that the conception of nothing is essentially relative, and always refers to a definite something, which it negatives. This quality has been attributed by Kant merely to the nihil privativum, which is indicated by, as opposed to, positive, which is negative. From an opposite point of view might become positive, and in opposition to this nihil privativum, the nihil negativum has been set up, which would in every reference be nothing, and as an example of this the logical contradiction which does away with itself has been given. But more closely considered, no absolute nothing, no proper nihil negativum is even thinkable, but everything of this kind, when considered from higher standpoint is absurd under a wider concept, is always merely a nihil privativum. Every nothing is thought as such only in relation to something, and presupposes this relation, and thus also this something. Even a logical contradiction is only a relative nothing. It is no thought of the reason, but is not on that account an absolute nothing, for it is a combination of words. It is an example of the unthinkable, which is necessary in logic in order to prove the laws of thought. Therefore, if for this end such an example is sought, we will stick to the nonsense of positive which we are in search of, and pass over the sense of the negative. Thus every nihil negativum, if subordinated to a higher concept, will appear as a mere nihil privativum, or relative nothing, which can, moreover, always exchange signs with worded negatives, so that that would then be thought as negation, and in itself as assertion. This also agrees with the result of the difficult dialectical investigation of the meaning of nothing which Plato gives in the Sophist, page 277 to 287. Tinto etero physinapotixandes, osante, que katakekermatis menin, epipandata onda prosalida, to prostohone castomorio aftis anditi themenon, etolmissa menepin, osafto to tuestin, ondostomion. Cum enim ostenderemus alterius ipsius naturam esse perque omnia entia divisam atque dispersam in vicem, tunc partem eius oppositam quod cuiusque es ipsum revera non ens asseruimus. That is generally received as positive, which we call the real, and the negation of which the concept nothing in its most general significance expresses, is just the world as idea, which I have shown to be the objectivity and mirror of the will. Moreover, we ourselves are just this will and this world, and to them belongs the idea in general, as one aspect of them. The form of the idea is space and time. Therefore, for this point of view, all that is real must be in some place and at some time. Denial, abolition, conversion of the will, is also the abolition and vanishing of the world, its mirror. If we no longer perceive it in this mirror, we ask in vain where it has gone, and then, because it is no longer anywhere and when, complain that it has vanished into nothing. A reverse point of view, if it were possible for us, would reverse the signs, and show the real first as nothing, and that nothing as the real. But as long as we ourselves are the will to live, This last, nothing as the real, can only be known and signified most negatively, because the old saying of Empedocles, that like only can be known by like, deprives us here of all knowledge, as, conversely, upon it finally rests the possibility of all our actual knowledge, i.e., the will as idea, for the world is self-knowledge of the will. If, however, it should be absolutely insisted upon that in some way or other positive knowledge should be attained of that which philosophy can only express negatively as a denial of the will, that there would be nothing for it but to refer to the state which all those who have attained to complete denial of the will have experienced, and which has been variously denoted by the name ecstasy, rapture, illumination, union with God, and so forth, a state, however, which cannot properly be called knowledge, because it is not the form of subject and object, and is, moreover, only attainable in one's own experience, and cannot be further communicated. We, however, who consistently occupy the standpoint of philosophy, must be satisfied here with a negative knowledge, content to have reached the utmost limit of positive. We have recognized the inmost nature of the world as will, and all its phenomena, as only the objectivity of will, and we have followed this objectivity from the unconscious working of obscure forces of nature up to the completely conscious action of man. Therefore we shall by no means evade the consequence, that with a free denial, the surrender of the will, all of those phenomena are also abolished, that constant strain and effort without end and without rest that toil the grace of activity, in which and through which the world consists, the multifarious forms exceeding each other in gradation, the whole manifestation of the will, and, finally, also universal forms of manifestation, time and space, and also its last fundamental form, subject and object, are all abolished. No will, no idea, no world. Before us there is certainly only nothingness, but that which resists is passing into nothing. Our nature is indeed just the will to live, which we ourselves are, as it is our world. That we abhor annihilation so greatly is simply another expression of the fact that we so extraneously will life, and are nothing but this will, and know nothing besides it. And if we turn our glance from our own needy and imbalanced condition to those who have overcome the world, in whom the will having attained to perfect self-knowledge, found itself again in all, and then freely denied itself, and who then merely wait to see the last trace of its vanish with the body which it animates, then instead of the restless striving and effort, instead of a constant transition from wish to fruition, and from joy to sorrow, instead of the never satisfied and never dying hope which constitutes the life of the man who wills, we shall see that peace which is above all reason, that perfect calm to spirit, that deep rest, that inviolable confidence and serenity, the mere reflection of which in the countenance, as Raphael and Correggio have represented it, is an entire and certain gospel. Only knowledge remains, the will has vanished. We look with deep and painful longing upon this state, beside which the misery and wretchedness of our own is brought out clearly by the contrast. Yet this is the only consideration which can afford us lasting consolation, when, on the one hand, we have recognized incurable suffering and endless misery as essential manifestation of will, the world, and, on the other hand, see the world pass away with the abolition of will, and retain before us only empty nothingness. Thus, in this way, by contemplation of the life and conduct of saints, whom it is certainly rarely granted us to meet with our own experience, but who are brought before our eyes by written history, and with the stamp of inner truth, by art, we must banish the dark impression of that nothingness which we discern behind all virtue and holiness as their final goal, and which we fear as children fear the dark. We must not even evade it like the Indians, through myths and meaningless words, such as reabsorption in Brahma or the Nirvana of the Buddhist. Rather do we freely acknowledge that what remains after the entire abolition of will is for all those who are still full of will certainly nothing, but, conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and has denied itself, this our world, which is so real, with all its suns and Milky Ways, is nothing. End of section 44, and End of the World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by